Most people believe they are reacting to the world in real time. Stimulus comes in and they respond accordingly. But this is a misunderstanding of how the human brain works. The brain is not a passive receiver of information. It is a highly complex prediction engine. Every moment, your brain is making thousands of micro predictions about what will happen next based on prior experiences, learned patterns, and emotional memory. By the time you feel like you're reacting to something, your nervous system has already made a prediction and initiated a cascade of physical and emotional responses. Neuroscience has shown that what we call reaction is actually a lagging process that starts before we're conscious of it. The visual cortex, amygdala, and brainstem circuits scan for patterns, facial expressions, tones of voice, movements, or even silence, and compare them to a vast database of stored experience. This comparison process is automatic, fast, and unconscious. If a situation feels similar to a past threat, your brain will immediately generate a response: tension, fear, frustration, without checking whether this new situation actually is a threat. The problem is that prediction isn't always accurate. This is where most people get stuck. They believe their emotional and behavioral reactions are happening to them as though they're powerless to stop it. But in reality, those reactions are simply well-rehearsed neural loops being executed. You're not broken. Your brain is doing its job, predicting what's most likely to happen and mobilizing your body and mind to prepare for it. However, if you want to reset your mind, you have to interrupt those predictions at the source. Consider a common scenario. Someone cuts you off in traffic. You feel instant irritation. Maybe you clench your jaw. Maybe you mutter something under your breath. But pause here. What really happened? Your eyes picked up a fast-moving car entering your lane. Your brain referenced past memories, rude drivers, unsafe situations, feelings of disrespect, and generated a narrative. They're disrespecting me. I'm in danger. I need to react. But none of this was verified. It was all prediction. The actual data is just a car moving. Your emotional surge is not about what just happened. It's about what your brain thinks it means. This predictive loop is deeply rooted in the brain's architecture. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational decision making, is often too slow to intervene once a strong prediction has been made and the body has begun reacting. This is why practicing control after the fact is almost impossible. You have to rewire how your brain makes predictions in the first place. That means teaching it new associations, new reference points, and most importantly, new patterns of response. The reset begins by creating space between stimulus and interpretation. One of the most effective tools is deliberate awareness. Catching yourself in the moment of prediction, noticing the jaw tension, recognizing the mental narrative, identifying the emotional spike before it becomes behavior. This pause allows the prefrontal cortex to step in and assess whether the prediction is accurate or simply outdated. You can also work on changing the predictive database itself. This is done through exposure to new experiences, emotional regulation training, and consistent self-reflection. If your brain learns that being interrupted doesn't always mean disrespect, or that conflict isn't always dangerous, or that not being in control doesn't equal failure, it will start generating new predictions. And with new predictions come new responses. Calmer, more precise, more intentional. Over time, the old reactive patterns lose their grip. Breathwork, visualization, journaling, and mindful movement all serve to train your nervous system in real time, creating a buffer between sensory input and automatic reaction. These techniques don't just calm you in the moment, they reshape how your brain anticipates the next moment. The ultimate goal isn't to be emotionless or detached. It's to reset your internal operating system so that you're responding to what's actually happening, not what your brain fears might happen based on outdated code. When you operate from prediction awareness rather than emotional automation, you reclaim control over your focus, your energy, and your outcomes. To truly reset the mind and control reactions, it's essential to understand that emotional responses are not purely psychological. They are physiological events driven by the autonomic nervous system, ANS. The ANS is the part of your nervous system that regulates involuntary processes, heart rate, breathing, digestion, and more. It operates beneath conscious awareness and is divided into two main branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic system is responsible for mobilizing the body in response to perceived threats, what we commonly know as the fight or flight response. The parasympathetic system, on the other hand, is responsible for calming the body down, promoting rest, digestion, and recovery. What most people don't realize is that these systems are not just responses to external danger. They are constantly interpreting your internal and external environment moment by moment. When you feel anxious, angry, frustrated, or overwhelmed, it's not just your thoughts that are the problem. Your nervous system is detecting cues, some obvious, some subtle, and activating stress physiology. These cues might come from an argument, a deadline, a difficult conversation, or even just an overwhelming number of notifications on your phone. Regardless of the source, once the sympathetic system is triggered, your body begins to prepare for action. Heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, muscles tense, and blood flow shifts away from your digestive system and toward your extremities. In this state, your cognitive processing changes. The brain becomes less capable of nuanced thought and more focused on immediate action. This is not a defect, it's an evolutionary design. When our ancestors faced a threat, quick reactions were more valuable than deep analysis. But in today's world, where most threats are psychological or social rather than physical, this system often works against us. A critical email from a boss, a disrespectful comment from a colleague, or a delay in your schedule can trigger the same physiological response as being chased. This mismatch between modern stressors and ancient biology is what leads to overreaction, burnout, and chronic anxiety. Resetting your mind then begins with resetting your body's baseline state. You cannot think your way out of a stress response that has already been activated. You must use tools that directly influence the autonomic nervous system. The fastest and most accessible tool is breath. Controlled breathing techniques, especially those that emphasize long exhales, activate the parasympathetic branch of the ANS. For example, the physiological sigh, which involves 2 short inhales followed by a long exhale, has been shown to rapidly reduce stress by shifting the body out of the sympathetic state. Another powerful intervention is deliberate cold exposure. Cold showers or cold plunges create a controlled stressor that trains the nervous system to stay calm under pressure. The key is not the cold itself, it's your ability to maintain controlled breathing and mental composure while the body is experiencing a spike in sympathetic activation. This builds what's called autonomic flexibility, your nervous system's capacity to return to baseline quickly after being stressed. That flexibility is the foundation of emotional control. Additionally, visual tools like panoramic vision, where you deliberately widen your gaze and take in more of your environment, can also downregulate the sympathetic system. When you're stressed, your vision narrows. Your eyes literally become tunnel focused. By reversing that pattern, expanding your visual field, you send a signal to your brain that you're not in immediate danger, which reduces stress hormone release and increases calm. Understanding that your emotions are deeply tied to your physiology gives you a new path to change. Rather than trying to suppress or outthink emotions, you begin to regulate them by working with your biology. You train your nervous system to become more resilient, less reactive, and more responsive. Over time, this nervous system training becomes automatic. Your baseline state becomes calmer. Your recovery from stress becomes faster. And your ability to choose your responses rather than be driven by them becomes more consistent. In this state, you create the conditions for mental clarity, sustained focus, and long-term behavioral change. When people talk about changing your mindset, they often refer to a vague mental shift or a motivational attitude adjustment. But mindset is not an abstract concept. It's a biological reality grounded in the principles of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience. It is not just something that happens during childhood. It continues throughout life, though its efficiency depends on deliberate effort and timing. Your mindset, how you interpret events, how you predict outcomes, how you view yourself and your environment is a direct product of the physical architecture of your brain, specifically the patterns of neural activity that have been reinforced over time. Every thought you have, every belief you hold, every interpretation you apply is underpinned by neurons firing in a certain sequence. The more often you think in a particular way, whether it's hopeful or helpless, empowering or limiting, the more those neural circuits become dominant. They grow stronger, faster, and more automatic. This is the core mechanism of mindset. It's not magic, it's biology. It means that what you practice mentally becomes who you are neurologically. If you've spent years reacting emotionally, catastrophizing setbacks, or expecting failure, your brain has wired for that pattern. It's efficient at it. It defaults to it. This doesn't mean you're broken. It means your nervous system has been shaped by repetition, often without conscious direction. But the same mechanism that wired those patterns in place can be used to rewire them. This is where intentional neuroplasticity comes into play. To reset your mindset, you need to repeatedly engage in thoughts, beliefs, and internal narratives that are aligned with the outcomes you want. But just thinking positively is not enough. The brain doesn't change because you wish for better thoughts. It changes through intensity, repetition, and emotional salience. This means you must engage your body and your nervous system in the process. Visualization, for example, is a powerful neuroplasticity tool when done correctly. If you mentally rehearse a future version of yourself, calm under pressure, focused, resilient, and you pair that image with physical stillness, controlled breathing, and high emotional engagement, your brain begins to interpret it as reality. This is not imagination, it's rewiring. When neurons fire together in that new pattern, the synaptic connections between them strengthen. The brain becomes more familiar with the new identity and starts predicting outcomes based on that framework. Suddenly, when real-world challenges show up, the brain doesn't default to the old survival-based prediction. It has a new script to follow, one that you've deliberately built through training. Another core component of mindset reshaping is reflection under stress. Most people reflect only when calm, but real rewiring happens when you reinterpret experiences during or immediately after a stressor. If you encounter a setback and you immediately frame it as data, not failure, your brain tags that experience differently. Instead of reinforcing helplessness, it builds a narrative of learning. Do that repeatedly, and your stress circuits begin to cooperate with your executive function, not override it. Mindset also changes through environment and identity cues. What you surround yourself with, who you interact with, and how you speak to yourself all play into the feedback loop of neuroplasticity. Your brain is constantly listening not just to external stimuli, but to your internal language. Phrases like, "I can't handle this," or "this always happens to me," reinforce one set of neural maps, replacing those with "I've handled things before," or "this is a challenge I can learn from," reinforces another. This isn't about pretending everything is fine. It's about consciously choosing which neural circuits get strengthened. The speed of neuroplastic change depends on your state of arousal. In states of heightened focus, especially when combined with novelty or slight discomfort, the brain is more malleable. That's why doing mindset work after exercise, during meditation, or following deliberate cold exposure can be more effective. The neuromodulators released in those states, like norepinephrine and acetylcholine, enhance attention and prime the brain for plasticity. This means you're not just thinking differently, you're carving new grooves in the brain's structure that make those thoughts more accessible, more natural, and eventually more automatic. Most people think emotional control is a personality trait, something you're either born with or not. But this belief is outdated and incorrect. Emotional control is not fixed. It's a skill set grounded in neural circuitry, and like any other skill, it can be developed, refined, and mastered through consistent, targeted training. Your ability to stay calm under pressure, to pause instead of lash out, to stay focused during conflict. These are outcomes of how well your nervous system has been trained to interpret and respond to internal and external stressors. To understand this more clearly, you have to look at what emotions are. Emotions are not random waves of feeling. They are biological signals generated by your brain and body in response to perceived challenges or rewards. They emerge from the interaction between your autonomic nervous system, your limbic system, especially the amygdala and hippocampus, and your cortical networks responsible for decision-making and attention. When you experience fear, frustration, or even joy, what you're really experiencing is a coordinated pattern of chemical, electrical, and muscular responses triggered by how your brain interprets a situation. This means that emotions are not problems, they are feedback. But if your system has never been trained to interpret this feedback properly, it reacts impulsively, often reinforcing the emotion rather than resolving it. For example, if you were never taught how to deal with frustration, then every time something doesn't go your way, your system will escalate more tension, more internal dialogue, more stress chemicals. That pattern becomes automatic. It becomes your normal. But automatic does not mean unchangeable. What changes this pattern is training. Emotional control is the result of strengthening the circuits that allow you to observe, process, and choose, not just feel and react. These circuits are located in the prefrontal cortex, the insular cortex, and parts of the anterior cingulate. When activated consistently through deliberate practices, these areas become more active and efficient. One of the most accessible ways to activate and train these regions is through breath regulation. Techniques like box breathing or the physiological sigh directly reduce sympathetic arousal, giving the thinking brain time to come online and regulate your emotional state. Another powerful protocol is journaling during emotional activation. Most people journal when they feel calm, but writing down thoughts while in the midst of emotional discomfort without trying to fix them builds what's called interoceptive awareness. It teaches your system to tolerate and understand emotional signals instead of avoiding or amplifying them. This practice literally rewires your perception of internal sensations, allowing you to stay in control even when your body is experiencing a stress spike. Exposure to controlled discomfort is another critical part of emotional training. This could be physical, like cold showers or intense exercise, or psychological, like public speaking practice or difficult conversations. The goal is not just to get through these experiences, but to observe your reactions during them and to practice conscious regulation. Every time you stay composed while your heart rate is elevated or while adrenaline is surging, you're training your nervous system to associate activation with control, not chaos. Repetition matters here. Just like you wouldn't expect to build physical strength from one workout, you can't expect emotional mastery from one meditation session or one deep breath. Daily micro-training sessions, brief moments of pause during stress, short reflective notes, consistent breath work, even brief posture checks, all accumulate. These moments send a signal to your brain. This environment is safe enough to stay regulated. That message is what begins to override the old emotional reflexes that were built on perceived threat. It's also essential to work on your emotional vocabulary. When you can name your internal state with precision, such as distinguishing between irritation, disappointment, or insecurity, you activate the prefrontal cortex more effectively. This act of labeling emotions reduces amygdala activation and increases cognitive control. So even something as simple as saying, "I'm not angry, I'm feeling dismissed," can redirect your brain toward regulation and away from reaction. Social rehearsal is another overlooked training tool. By mentally simulating future stressful interactions and rehearsing calm responses, you create a memory bank of control. The brain doesn't fully distinguish between imagined and real experiences when the simulation is vivid. By running these simulations frequently and pairing them with controlled breathing or posture cues, you're priming your nervous system to respond with strength and clarity when the real moment arrives. In high-pressure situations, many people rely on how they feel in the moment to determine what they do next. They wait to feel motivated before taking action. They wait to feel calm before having a hard conversation. They wait to feel confident before starting something new. But the truth is, feelings are not reliable indicators of effective action. Emotions are useful signals. They inform you about what your body and brain are experiencing, but they are not strategies. Lasting results come from executing clear, repeatable systems and behaviors, regardless of emotional state. Precision, not emotion, is the mechanism that leads to predictable success. When you examine the habits of high performers, athletes, scientists, creators, military operators, you see one consistent theme: execution under variability. They don't wait until everything feels right. They move forward using protocols that have been stress tested. What separates these individuals from the average person isn't more talent or intelligence. It's that their actions are guided by rehearsed routines, not by emotional fluctuation. This is a trainable skill rooted in the brain's executive function, specifically in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for planning, impulse control, and rational decision-making. To operate from precision, your nervous system must decouple action from emotional intensity. That begins with building awareness of how often emotions are directing your behavior. When stress levels rise, whether from internal worry or external pressure, your system automatically shifts into reaction mode. Your focus narrows, decision quality declines, and instinct takes over. In this state, people tend to either freeze, flee, or force things. Precision is lost. But when you train yourself to recognize this state, you regain the option to pivot toward clarity-based action. Precision is built through predefined routine. These routines should be clear enough to follow under pressure and simple enough to execute even when the emotional brain is hijacking your system. For example, if your goal is to remain composed during difficult conversations, you might create a behavioral checklist. Ground your feet, soften your gaze, speak 20% slower than normal, and pause before responding. These are not emotional instructions, they are mechanical protocols. You don't need to feel calm to act calmly. You simply follow the routine until the emotional state aligns later. In neuroscience, this approach is called top-down regulation. It refers to the process where the higher order parts of your brain, the frontal lobes, guide and override lower level reflexes generated by the limbic system. The more you use top-down control, the more dominant those circuits become. They strengthen with repetition, just like muscles. Eventually, the brain begins to default to planned behavior instead of emotional reactivity. This is how emotional control and consistent performance become automatic, not through suppression, but through redirection. Another component of precision-based behavior is feedback. Precision is not about perfection. It's about measurement, reflection, and adjustment. After a task, especially one involving stress or challenge, review what went well and what can be improved. This reflection must be objective. Avoid framing mistakes emotionally. Instead of thinking I failed, shift to I executed step 1 and 2 correctly, but rushed step 3. This kind of feedback loop strengthens neural learning pathways. It teaches the brain to adapt quickly without attaching unnecessary emotional weight to mistakes. To anchor these habits deeper, integrate them with physiological tools. For instance, if you're about to engage in something that normally triggers emotion, public speaking, conflict, or decision making, use pre-performance breath work, such as 3 rounds of the physiological sigh. This primes the nervous system to receive stress signals without overreacting. Then execute your routine. Afterward, return to a recovery protocol like slow nasal breathing or posture release. These micro recoveries signal safety to your nervous system and reinforce that you can move through tension without being controlled by it. A final element in developing precision over emotion is redefining your identity in the context of stress. Instead of saying, I'm bad under pressure, begin to condition the belief, I execute under pressure because I've trained for it. Identity-based cognition wires directly into your self-regulation circuits. When your behavior aligns with that identity, repeatedly, the brain rewires itself to expect success even before it happens. Over time, this internal shift reduces dependency on temporary feelings and replaces it with a system that generates results through deliberate, intentional, and repeatable actions rooted in protocol, not impulse.